It took exactly 47 seconds. 47 seconds for Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to destroy the most powerful immigration advisor in American history, with nothing but leaked emails, a steady voice, and the kind of prosecutorial precision that ends careers on live television. Stephen Miller sat frozen at the witness table, his carefully constructed mask finally cracking. What happened next wasn't just political theater. It was the moment when America's immigration debate became personal, visceral, and impossible to ignore. March 22, 2025. House Oversight Committee hearing room. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Stephen Miller entered with the confidence of someone who had survived 1,000 political battles. Navy suit pressed to perfection, American flag pin positioned precisely on his lapel. He looked like a man who had rehearsed every possible question, anticipated every potential attack. He had no idea he was walking into an ambush that would define his legacy forever. But this story doesn't begin on March 22nd. It begins 3 weeks earlier, in a cramped basement office in the Rayburn House office building, where AOC's chief of staff had been pulling all-nighters. Spread across her desk were documents that told a story of systematic cruelty, deliberate family destruction, and policy decisions made with full knowledge of the human cost. "Senator," her deputy said at 2:47 a.m., sliding a manila folder across the cluttered desk, "we found something that's going to change everything." AOC studied the documents with the intensity that had made her legendary. These weren't just policy memos. They were internal DHS communications, emails between Stephen Miller and ICE officials, planning documents for what they internally called Operation Consequence. And the dates mattered because they showed Miller knew exactly what would happen to separated children before the policy was implemented. "Show me the worst one," AOC said quietly. Her chief of staff pulled out a single email marked "Sensitive, Internal Only." It was dated April 15, 2018, 3 weeks before family separations became official policy. The subject line read, "Acceptable loss, parameters for separated minors." AOC read it 3 times, her face growing paler with each pass. "We're going to ask him about this, under oath, on camera, and we're going to watch him try to explain how this doesn't make him a monster." Meanwhile, Stephen Miller was dealing with a different kind of pressure. In his West Wing office, he was reviewing talking points with his communications director. The House hearing was scheduled in 3 weeks, and Miller's preparation was legendary in its thoroughness. "They're going to go hard on family separation," his aide warned. "Ocasio-Cortez has been vocal about making this personal." Miller waved dismissively. "I've handled tougher crowds than a freshman congresswoman playing to her Twitter followers. The policy was legal, it was necessary, and it worked as a deterrent." But privately, Miller was worried. His phone buzzed with a text from a former DHS official. "Heard there might be document leaks coming. Might want to review what you put in writing 2018-2019. Miller's jaw tightened. What he didn't know was that the most damaging emails had already left the building, copied onto an encrypted drive, delivered to a congressional office that knew exactly how to use them. The hearing room felt different that morning. AOC entered carrying a single leather portfolio, deceptively slim, but containing enough documentation to end a career. She didn't look angry. She looked focused, clinical, like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Miller entered with his characteristic confidence, but observers who knew him well noticed subtle differences. His smile was slightly forced. His eyes scanned the room more frequently than usual. His fingers drummed against his briefcase before he caught himself and stopped. The first hour unfolded exactly as Washington political theater typically does. Republican members asked friendly questions about border security. Miller answered with practiced ease, looking comfortable, professional. Democrats were pointed, but predictable, standard oversight territory that Miller navigated skillfully. But AOC hadn't asked a single question. She sat quietly, occasionally making notes, letting her colleagues exhaust their time while she prepared for surgical precision. Miller noticed. During a brief procedural pause, he leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The answer would come soon enough, and it would be more devastating than he could possibly imagine. At exactly 11:34 a.m., AOC raised her hand. The gesture was calm, almost casual, but its effect was electric. The entire chamber shifted forward. "Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 5 minutes for questions." Even the room's temperature seemed to change. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Mr. Miller," AOC began, her voice carrying a deceptive warmth. "Thank you for being here today. I want to start by acknowledging that immigration policy involves complex trade-offs and difficult decisions." Miller relaxed slightly. The opening was disarming, reasonable, nothing like the aggressive confrontation he'd been expecting. "Thank you, Congresswoman," Miller replied. "I appreciate your recognition that these are complicated issues without simple solutions." "I'm glad you mentioned complexity," AOC continued, "because I want to ask about a specific policy decision, the family separation protocol implemented in spring 2018. Miller's shoulders tensed imperceptibly. "As you know, Congresswoman, that policy was designed to enforce existing law and deter illegal border crossings." "So you stand by the policy?" AOC asked. "I stand by the legal authority under which it was implemented and the security objectives it was designed to achieve," Miller responded carefully. "That's helpful context," AOC said, reaching into her portfolio, "because I want to share some documents that provide additional context about how that policy was designed and what outcomes were anticipated." Miller's face didn't change, but his hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his pen. Documents meant leaks. Leaks meant danger. "These are Internal Department of Homeland Security communications," AOC continued, holding up printed emails. "Specifically, exchanges between you and senior ICE officials in the weeks before family separation became official policy." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I'm going to read from an email you sent on April 15, 2018. Subject line: Acceptable loss parameters for separated minors." Miller's face drained of color. That email wasn't supposed to exist anymore. "Mr. Chairman," Miller's attorney interrupted, "these appear to be privileged internal deliberations." "These emails were provided through proper whistleblower channels," AOC replied, without looking away from Miller. "And I believe the American people have a right to hear what their government was planning." Chairman Raskin banged his gavel. "The witness will answer questions. Proceed, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez." AOC looked directly at Miller, and for the first time that morning, her voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Mr. Miller, in this email you wrote, and I quote, 'We need to establish acceptable loss parameters for separated minors. Based on current detention capacity and processing rates, we should anticipate that approximately 15–20% of separated children will not be successfully reunited with parents within 90 days. This is operationally acceptable, provided media exposure is managed appropriately.'" The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single person in that hearing room moved. Miller opened his mouth, then closed it. The man who had spent his career crafting precise responses looked like he'd been hit by a truck. But AOC wasn't finished. She had 47 seconds left, and she was going to use every one of them. "You wrote acceptable loss parameters to describe children being permanently separated from their parents. You wrote that 15–20% of children not being reunited was operationally acceptable." Her voice rose slightly. "You didn't write unfortunate or regrettable. You wrote acceptable, as if losing track of hundreds of children was just another line item in a budget proposal." Miller tried to respond. "Congresswoman, that email is being taken completely out of context. It's standard terminology for describing how many children you were willing to lose." AOC's voice cut through his explanation. "Because that's what acceptable loss means. You knew children would be lost. You calculated approximately how many, and you decided that number was acceptable. The word lost here refers to temporary tracking challenges, not to children being permanently separated." Miller protested, his composure cracking. Then why? AOC continued, producing another email. Did you write this follow-up 3 days later? Current legal guidance suggests permanent separation outcomes may be difficult to remedy through administrative channels. Recommend we proceed with current protocols and address reunification issues retroactively if media pressure becomes unmanageable. The chamber erupted. Democratic members gasped audibly. Republican members looked genuinely shocked. You knew reunification might be impossible, AOC said. You knew children might be permanently separated from their parents. And your recommendation was to proceed anyway and deal with it later if the media made it a problem. Miller's composure completely collapsed. That email is a legal analysis of potential challenges, not a policy recommendation. It's your words, Mr. Miller. AOC held up the printed email. Your email address, your signature, your recommendation to proceed despite knowing children would be lost forever. The 47 seconds were over, but the destruction was complete. The immediate aftermath was surgical devastation. Associated Press at 11:36 a.m. Miller emails show deliberate planning of child separation outcomes. By 11:39, acceptable loss was trending with over 100,000 mentions. Within minutes, the video had been viewed 3 million times. But the real devastation was in the faces around the chamber. Front-row immigration advocates sat with tears streaming down their faces. Even some Republican members looked physically ill. Representative Maria Salazar was shaking her head. Representative Tony Gonzalez had turned away entirely. Miller looked like he was drowning. His famous composure had completely abandoned him. Those emails represented contingency planning, he managed finally. The language may sound harsh, outside of its proper operational context. Mr. Miller, AOC interrupted, ice cold. Did you or did you not calculate that hundreds of children would be permanently lost and decide to proceed anyway? It was a yes or no question with no escape. The policy involved accepting certain operational risks in service of broader enforcement objectives. Miller said desperately. That's a yes, AOC said flatly. You calculated the number of children who would be lost forever, and you decided it was worth it. Conservative media struggled to defend the indefensible. Even Tucker Carlson opened his show with criticism. If these emails are real, this isn't about border security. This is about being willing to destroy families as a political strategy. The leaked emails contain dozens more damning communications. One from May 2018 showed Miller responding to concerns about detention capacity. If shelter capacity becomes an issue, that actually serves our deterrence objectives. The worse the conditions look, the stronger the message we send. Perhaps most damaging was an exchange from July 2018. We're taking heat now, but history will vindicate this approach. Sometimes deterrence requires accepting short-term political damage. Every family that decides not to come because they fear separation is a victory. The emails painted a picture of calculated cruelty, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage as deterrence. And the calculation that some children would be permanently lost wasn't a side effect. It was intentional. Within 72 hours, Democratic leadership called for criminal investigations. Republican senators began distancing themselves. Immigration groups filed emergency motions seeking to hold Miller personally liable. The UN Human Rights Council announced a formal inquiry. Career DHS officials came forward with their own stories. We received specific guidance from Miller's office to separate families even when rapid reunification was possible, testified Special Agent Maria Rodriguez. The cruelty wasn't a side effect. It was the point. Journalists tracked down families who had been separated and never reunited. A Guatemalan mother deported while her 6-year-old remained in custody for 18 months. A Honduran father released in California while his twin daughters were held in Texas. By the time he found them, they no longer recognized him. Each story came with the same devastating coda. This wasn't bureaucratic error. This was exactly what Stephen Miller had planned for. The hearing continued. But Miller never recovered. Democratic members took turns reading additional emails, each more damning than the last. Republican members remained largely silent, unwilling to defend the indefensible. Miller left through a side door at 4:47 p.m., surrounded by security, his face ashen. He didn't take questions. He simply disappeared into a waiting SUV. Stephen Miller's career as a government official was over. No future administration could employ someone whose emails proved he had deliberately designed a system to traumatize children as political strategy. 6 months later, when political scientists analyzed congressional hearings of 2025, AOC's 47-second destruction of Stephen Miller was universally cited as a watershed moment. Not just for immigration policy, but for accountability itself. Law students would study AOC's questioning as a masterclass in oversight. Ethics courses would use Miller's emails as case studies in how bureaucratic language disguises moral catastrophe. But for the families who lived through separation, for the children who still wake up screaming, those 47 seconds came too late. The acceptable loss parameters Stephen Miller calculated weren't about database tracking. They were about real children with real trauma that no policy revision could undo. What shocked America was the cold calculation, the clinical precision with which Miller had designed maximum family trauma, and then described permanent family destruction as operationally acceptable. Those 47 seconds revealed that sometimes the cruelty really is the point. And sometimes, when the truth finally comes out, even the most powerful advisors can't hide behind bureaucratic language. Stephen Miller's legacy was written in 2 words from his own email: acceptable loss. And America would never forget what he had deemed acceptable.